Hello and welcome to the World Lens podcast. I am Curtis Sprung, your erstwhile producer and host today, subbing in for Michelle Evans. I'm here talking to Bruce McIndoe about a completely uncontroversial, boring topic, the U.S. presidential election. Now, a quick note to all of our listeners. We are recording this episode on Thursday, October 31st, which is before Election Day. By the time this episode comes out, we may already know who the next president of the United States is. And that's actually a great place for us to start. Bruce, in 2020, it took days before the election was finally called for Joe Biden. Once upon a time, it felt like we would get the results the night of. What's going on here?
Lots of things are going on. I guess, in 2020, it took about 4 days, I guess, for AP and CNN to call the election, but Biden didn't declare a victory until Saturday, right?
Right.
So that extended. And, what's going on is that elections are conducted by the states, right?
Okay.
So we're talking about 50 elections. And the reality is it's actually districts within, or election zones or districts that are actually conducting and counting and then rolling it up to the state level. So there's hundreds if not thousands of elections going on, and we don't have uniform rules.
Right.
Right. So like in Pennsylvania, which is a really important state this year, right? Key swing state, that they're not even allowed to start counting the mail-in votes that are coming in until the end of the election night on the election day. Then they can add those counts in.
Okay.
So by definition, we're already past the evening, right? And especially with Pennsylvania being such a key state, we're not going to know just for what's happening in Pennsylvania for several days. So that's just the way it is and the way it's going to be, unless there's some standard federal election law that dictates how states run elections, and probably not in my lifetime. So
No, it's I would agree there. Don't think it's something we're going to see anytime soon.
no.
So there's a lot of factors at play here. And this year in particular, all eyes are going to be watching the election very closely. There are many, many people out there who still believe that the 2020 election between Joe Biden and Donald Trump was stolen. And it sounds like some of those people have found their way into positions of power when it comes to counting and certifying those local vote counts. What does that all mean? Could someone on a local level, actually do something to affect the outcome of the election?
Okay, so let me just put the bottom line up front. Local officials cannot block the election certification in the state.
Okay.
That's been gone through the courts and all kinds of rulings that look, this is an administrative effort. Then it goes to the state for to confirm or certify the vote for the state. So, but what they can do is create a lot of noise, mistrust, delays, and that's what we'll expect. This year, we call it the election denial movement, right? So they have shifted their efforts onto this local certification process, which is why everyone is up and nervous and what's going to happen. And and they've been claiming that local officials can, they have the power to refuse and not certify the election results. So all of that activity leading up to this moment has been defeated, and in court and through the state legislature. So we're going to expect some delays where they can, demand recounts. They can even refuse, like they did in 2020, to certify. Right.
Yeah.
And then that, went around and around until, the, attorney general came in on them and said, if you keep this up, you're going to be in a world of hurt. And then they finally said, uncle. Right. So expect that. That's going to happen. And there are, legions of lawyers waiting for the election night to end, and off they'll go. So that'll be a whole nother distraction and set of activities that are going to delay how this all plays out.
All right. Yeah. Somebody's going to be billing some overtime hours there and making some money.
Yeah,
Uh,
well, they'll never exceed what the ad companies have won out of the billions of dollars of ads. So that's where the money's made in elections.
Gosh, no kidding. Now, you mentioned there, the lawyers coming in and recounts and all those things, and that brings
Hmm.
to mind, a very important election that was contested and had a unique outcome among
Hmm.
American history, which is the race between George W. Bush and Al Gore in 2000,
The
which
famous
was
hanging Chad, right?
that's right. It was decided by a landmark ruling by the Supreme Court. So
Hmm.
let's kind of make some assumptions here. What would it take for a race to make it to the Supreme Court again? Does it have to have that, unique quality of the recount and all of these types of things going on again?
Well, I don't think we need to go back to 2000. We can go back to 2020, right? I mean, Trump tried his best, to get the Supreme Court to overturn, his loss in the presidential elect, and the justices didn't bite, right? So there you go. It didn't have anything to do with anything. Yes, there's parties and elections and all kinds of noise and stuff, but this can be forced to the Supreme Court, but they don't necessarily have to respond to it. And I think what I've seen of the Supreme Court around the actual election activities is a reticence to get involved and especially to award the presidency to not the perceived winner, whether that's by the electoral college or if that's tied by popular vote, right? So
Yeah.
anyway, so that's the thing. If there's sufficiently clear margin in the outcome of this election, then we won't have to worry about the Supreme Court. And I think. Again, I just feel like they're going to do everything possible to keep out of it. They already have enough problems and perceived mistrust by large number of. I think they have the worst rate, kind of rating from the citizens of this country than they've ever had. Right. So
Yeah, that
that
was
would be
gonna that
yeah.
was gonna be my next question. I mean, the justices have
Oh.
been under so much scrutiny right now. There's, all these cases of gifts and things that folks have
Hmm.
taken, and public trusts on the Supreme Court is at an all-time low. Uh, so, if we got into a situation like that, you think the court would just say, this is not we don't want to deal with it. We don't want we don't want to talk to this. We're under too much scrutiny as it is.
Yeah, I mean the Supreme Court today, for first off, is substantially different from what it was 24 years ago, right?
Oh yeah.
In 2000. But so are the voters, right? And I would say maybe even more so because we're in a deeply divided nation with the majority on both sides viewing each other as an existential threat, right?
Yeah.
And that's a dangerous place to be. And we've already seen what happened on January 6th in the last election. And I would expect that regardless of how the Supreme Court comes or goes, that we're going to see um, unrest. And this unrest is going to be throughout the United States, not focused on the Capitol building like it was in 2020, but it's going to be I liken it to the George Floyd protests, right?
Okay.
As I recall, somewhere between 140, 150 cities were, had protests and significant unrest and damage and, and murders, right? And all kinds of things. So that's my concern that, if this is very close and there's lots of misinformation and distrust about the outcome by both parties, but even if one is fueling it, and that's what I work in the risk and security side. The federal government, state and local governments have been planning for that kind of eventuality to be prepared this time and not be caught flat-footed, right? So
Yeah.
the big question will be, can law enforcement, state, National Guard, and all of that manage this unhappiness, angst, and protest that could come out of a very close election. That's what I'm concerned about. I think the Supreme Court will uh, not necessarily not necessarily be a major factor in that, unless there's a clear reason that they would rule on a particular case to them. So that's the backdrop of all this, and I'm sure they don't want to be the ones to fuel national unrest.
Yeah. Well, hopefully no more hanging chads, right?
I think that'll be the least of our problems.
Well, regardless of who wins,
Ultimately.
ultimately, President Biden will leave office, and we'll have a
Hmm.
new president. But both of our candidates right now are not total unknowns. And so, before we dig into
Hmm.
specific policies, let's kind of just take a quick overview of the candidates. Let's start with the Democratic candidate and current Vice President Kamala Harris. If she wins, she is currently part of the Biden administration. Do you think we're going to see a continuation of those policies?
I get the general consensus that I see and read. The Harris administration will be what a steady as she goes government, right? So kind
Okay.
of more of what we expect, how and the U.S. government to act and to be run, right? So how steady and how fast things get done will depend on the rest of the election, right? Who controls the House and the Senate, right? So if Democrats were to actually sweep the election, which is, we'll maybe hopefully talk about polls, that's perfect, that's within the margin of error, right? That they could
Right.
sweep it, right? So it's possible. Then we can see, much more of her agenda being taken up and being passed if they control, both chambers of Congress. But so I would say, she will have her own imprint, but how the government is managed and what it's focused on and its ability to operate will be pretty much steady state.
Yeah.
Mhm.
But it's kind of interesting because now Vice President Harris is running a very different campaign than when Senator Harris ran back in 2020. She's made some of those flip flops that we like to talk about,
Mhm.
things like, Medicare for all or bans on fracking. Do you think she returns to some of those original ideas that she had, a couple years ago? Or again, still kind of staying where she is now?
There will be no stand your ground for President Harris. I think she has sensed, uh, and I think, taking input on the election trail and talking to people has really started to broaden her kind of, from maybe like Medicaid for all. Okay, well maybe we need to think about that differently. So I think she's in that mode. I think that she will be tempered by the reality of the office and also what happens in Congress, right? As far
Right.
as who controls Congress. So I do think she will try to work across the aisle and push legislation, as she said, kind of to help all American families, such as medical care and whether that's Medicaid for all or just broadening access and lower cost to healthcare for the average American. I think she's going to be all in on that. But I don't think on things like banning fracking. I think she's already learned that lesson that there's no support for that or little support for that, and she's going to be pragmatic and focus on things that I think she has talked about, and I said broadly would say the middle class, which is we see these billionaires pouring money into the Trump campaign, and I think part of that is uh, you know if she's elected and if the Democrats do control the House, we're going to see higher tax rates on the wealthy and ultra wealthy, and that will go to paying down some of the deficit, but more importantly, enacting some of these middle class, things that they've talked through. So that's what I think will kind of happen as she gets in.
Yeah.
And
And you
then,
use
of
that.
course, if they don't. control Congress, then we'll be back to where we are, just flipped, right? Deadlock and wrangling and all those kinds of things. So we could maybe talk more about that later.
Yeah. Well, you used an interesting word there. You used pragmatic. And, I don't know if that's a word that I would use to describe former President Donald Trump, who is still promising he's going to make America great again. And in these last few days of the election, he's specifically saying he can bring us back to the halcyon days of 2019. Is that something, even possible in a post-COVID world? Do we want to go back to 2019?
Yeah. So, I have no clue what, back to 2019 means in his mind. So, and I don't know that anyone does. I think, that's when he felt great again, right?
Okay.
So maybe that's what we're going. I don't, I talk to a lot of people, talk to a lot of conferences. I don't think there's any significant number of people that would want to relive the last 4 years.
That's fair.
So that would be my assessment of that. And the fact is, the world's changed substantially. The country has changed, and not only in politics, but we've been beat up, with hurricanes and other challenges. Of course, inflation that romped on, I don't know, 8-9% in mid 2022 was very painful, and all of that has changed the psyche of the country, and businesses have changed as a result of that, right? So,
Yeah.
And then of course we see technology, AI. So all of that, there is no interest in going back to 2019, and it's not even possible. That would be my assessment.
That's fair. That's
All
fair.
right.
One of those other things that the Trump campaign has been tied to this election cycle was Project 2025, though he maintains that's not something that he or his campaign created. But it is kind of that conservative blueprint for America. If we see another Trump presidency, does he start to implement, Project 2025?
He can try to distance himself from 2025, and yeah, and that's fine. He can say, look, I didn't create it, and my campaign didn't create it. Okay, that's factually true, right? But the people that created it are people that have been in his orbit, right? And so what I would say is that if he is president, the people in that orbit were going to put substantial pressure on him to implement as many of those policies as possible. And and pretend, depending on how you can kind of communicate to him, see what transactionally is of value to him by doing so. I think they feel like they're going to get a lot of those policies enacted if what happens to Congress.
That's right.
So, okay.
Yeah. So, let's go through a couple of the major issues that the candidates kind of differ on. And we're going to start with healthcare, which we've already kind of alluded to a couple times.
Okay.
But, during the Trump presidency, the Senate very famously failed to overturn the Affordable Care Act. John McCain, with that dramatic thumbs down.
Right.
We've already talked a little bit about, who controls Congress. It's going to matter. But you think if Trump wins, do Republicans take another run at repealing the ACA?
I absolutely believe that Trump and the Republicans will move to repeal the Affordable Care Act.
Really?
Yes.
Okay.
And I think even Johnson, has teased this out a little bit, right, in the last 24 hours, and so and he does have a concept of a plan to replace it. So, so I think that as they really focus on this, I hope that they will come to their senses and pull together some new variant, whatever this concept ultimately morphs into.
Yeah.
And then they will, come up with this variant, and it wouldn't surprise me that the variant will just be a tweaking of ACA, and call it a new name and push it through and declare victory. So,
It's something that we've seen before from both
yes,
sides.
exactly.
All right. Well, on the opposite side here, we saw the overturning of Roe versus Wade by the Supreme Court in 2022. If Vice President Harris wins, do Democrats try to codify the right to an abortion at the federal level?
Similar to Trump, I absolutely believe that the Harris administration will work tirelessly, regardless of the makeup of the Congress, to codify the right to an abortion at the federal level. Absolutely. That's been the major foundational stone of the campaign. And I think we're going to see unprecedented numbers of women that come out to vote. And we've seen it state by state already.
Yeah.
So that, yes, she
Yeah.
and her administration will beat that drum really hard.
Yeah. No, that has definitely proven to be a winning issue across the board, pretty much in any state that it has come up. So
Yeah, and it's just having been a Republican back in the day, part of that Republican ethos was keeping the government out of your business.
yeah,
And it's just interesting to me how it has so morphed, and now banning books and DEI, and who can get a transsexual surgery, and who can get all of this stuff that is being pushed, that they want government control in people's lives. So and it's why it's hard for me to even say like Republican, Democrat. The both parties, I feel like they need to rebrand, right? So, but we'll
let's
take that in another episode.
let's bring back the Whigs and the Bull Moose Party, right? Those are some throwbacks to American
Yeah,
history.
exactly. Okay.
All right, so let's talk trade for a little bit now.
Oh, great. Okay.
We love it. Former President Trump seems to be all in on tariffs to boost the American economy. He has proposed, I want to say something like a minimum of 10% tax
Right.
on all foreign goods, up to something like 60% tax on
50, 60%. Yep. On
yeah,
Chinese.
Chinese made goods. Now, is this a drastic shift from when he was previously in office? And wouldn't those kinds of tariffs just immediately be passed on to us here shopping in our Walmart?
So let's say yes, this would be a massive shift from when he was in office.
Okay.
When they did use tariffs in a more targeted way, right? Which is okay. That's you tweak it and do these kinds of things. And my guess is that power is what intrigues him and why he loves tariffs, right? It's the best thing since sliced bread. So, so I guess that maybe that's what his thinking is. But pretty much he stands alone on this tariff issue. When
Yeah.
I look at the business groups and their voice in this, they're like, this is not good. Don't do it. When I look at economists, both in the United States and externally, for example, through the Economist magazine, have just written, articles walking through why that would be really terrible, right?
Yeah.
And what I think people need to understand is that tariffs, when they're imposed on importers, when those goods come into the United States, the receiving company that purchased those goods
Right.
pays the tariff. Right? The
Right.
country shipping it, or the country that's shipping it, is not paying the tariffs to the government or anybody. The company that receives that in the United States pays the tariff. They have two choices. They either eat it, or they increase prices on the consumer, or the next stage down in the supply chain to
Right.
absorb that cost. So at the end of the day, those tariffs increase costs on the consumer of those goods. That's the fact.
Right.
But tariffs are not unilateral, because we can raise tariffs And our trading partners on the other end, now that their products are more expensive and less attractive in the market, which is the whole Chinese reason, right, for
Right.
punching tariffs up, they sit back and say, oh, we can play that game too, right? So then
Right.
they raise the tariffs on US goods coming into their market, which makes us less attractive, right? Less competitive. And so we lose market share, and our US businesses have depressed revenues. That's why they don't like it, right?
Right.
So the tariffs are not something to be toyed with. They are a useful tool in, surgical reasons and rationales, but across the board like that would be uh, counterproductive for the globe, let
Yeah.
alone the United States.
No, I think about, I mean, you and Michelle have talked about this on the podcast before, but
Mhm.
on, Chinese electric vehicles, that is a very targeted style of tariff to,
Mhm.
kind of try and balance the scales on who's producing those. But to say just a flat, X% feels like, taking a hammer to try and solve all your problems.
But even with the electric vehicles, that's fine. Okay, so either Americans are willing to pay that 50% more, right? Or China just goes and sells them into other markets, closing out those markets from US manufacturers and
Yeah.
producers, right? So it's an ecosystem. It's not a one and done. So yeah, it's
Well,
complicated.
Well, on the other hand, Vice President Harris looks like she wants to ease inflation. Went on her website, took it out. Looks like she wants to crack down on mergers and acquisitions and investigate price fixing, specifically talking about food products.
Hmm.
And is that actually the reason why things like when I go to the grocery store, milk and eggs are so expensive? And for something like that, how long is it going to take for us to feel that at the grocery store?
Yeah, it's complicated.
Everything's complicated, right?
Yeah, exactly. Let's start from the top line, inflation, right? So the Federal Reserve and the Biden administration has already tamed inflation. It's currently running about 2.4%, which is what that level was back in 2021, right?
Right.
Yes, as we spent, huge amounts of money and gave people lots of money to handle the shock of the pandemic, we saw inflation run up to, like 9%, kind of mid 2022. And so when those costs went up with companies and which is what drives inflation, right? People felt that, but the government was pumping money into the economy that was enabling people to pay those prices, right? So
Right.
the boats lifted, right? And then the Federal Reserve came in, and the pandemic passed, and that stimulus was pulled away, and so demand. So all of those things have caused inflation to come down to relatively historic levels, a couple percent. So that's where we need to be. But the prices, you know, are is on at they're basically a one way ticket, right? As prices go up, okay, wages and salaries go up and those kinds of things, and the system kind of balances itself out. If we were to push prices down, well, what does that mean? That means something has gone wrong with the economy, right? We call it, and deflation or stagnation,
Right.
those stagflation. So so really what we have to focus on is like what's happening as these prices have increased now to wages. Well, wages have increased 4.2% since 2021, right?
Right.
So the market is adjusting, and so instead of these manufacturers like having these high prices but their costs have remained the same and they have huge profits, yeah, they have pretty solid profits, but wages, and we saw in the negotiations recently with Boeing and others, wages are going up and those profits are going to get back to kind of normal levels. So what I try to do is when put this in terms that people can relate to, right?
Yeah.
And so so on average in the United States, wages grew $16,700 since 2021. Okay. When you look
Okay.
at price growth during that period, it was about $3,800. Right.
Okay.
So so on average, and I'm not arguing down for very low income families who got hammered, but on average, wages have gone up substantially more than those price increases in the average household. So anyway, and businesses don't like lower prices, right?
Very true.
So, unless they have to. So anyway, so the kind of my final word, like on inflation, is we need to focus on something bigger. If we really want to, and what I try to talk to people about is if we don't start focusing on the federal budget deficit, we are going to see way more headwinds than what we have seen relative to, uh, you know, product, staple price increases in inflation. And, long term, large deficits are detrimental to our economic growth and stability. It's that simple. And
Right.
this is another area of significant difference between the two parties and the two candidates. They've done some analysis, and kind of the midpoint on the Harris policies and those things would run up the deficit, another 4 trillion through, I think, 2030 or 2035. But when they look at the President Trump's, keeping the tax breaks and all of these kinds of things, is looking at about an $8 trillion increase in the deficit. So
Yeah.
these are the things that we should be talking about with the electorate. Not is this poll up one or down one, and and who's a garbage can and who's a dump site, and whatever. It's like, why isn't the media talking to the electorate as responsible adults and educating them on not only what's going on, but where is this going?
Yeah.
And I can't even imagine adding another, having an $8 trillion federal deficit to be funding, and the impacts that that's going to have. So anyway, I'll get off my soapbox.
Well, who knows where it's gonna go? It'll be. I don't know if the word interesting is what I want to use here, but we'll see what happens.
Challenging.
Challenging. Very. There you go.
All right.
All right. So let's change topics once
Okay,
more.
good.
All right. We'll jump over to the judiciary now.
Oh, great.
Former President Trump, he appointed 3 Supreme Court justices during his term and many
Hmm.
others at the lower levels. But you've hinted at this earlier. These kinds of appointments require the participation of the Senate.
Hmm.
And the possibility of one party controlling the Senate and one party controlling the presidency is very, very real. Are we just going to see another stalemate if that happens?
Um, so just to be clear, all federal judges and Supreme Court justices nominated by the president must be confirmed by the Senate. That's why
Right.
it's such an important chamber of Congress, right? And uh, a GOP controlled Senate would impose, kind of an immediate threat to Harris's presidential ambitions, right?
Right.
Narrowing her personal choices and limiting her policy agenda, but delaying her cabinet appointments have to go
Oh,
through
yeah.
the Senate, right?
Very true.
And obviously curbing any influence that she might have on future Supreme Court vacancies, so they could play this, put the roadblocks in and we'll wait for a Republican president, right? And they played that before. So I think, again, just that whole mix, that elections are not just a person, the president. It's really the whole mix of House and Senate and how it all works together. But both sides are, gaming through the scenario of, okay, what if Trump's in office and we have Democratic Senate and or House? What if
Right.
the vice versa and all that? And I read an article, I don't know, maybe a month or two ago, just on like the litany of strategies that are at hand. For example, must pass legislation, right? You just start hammering stuff into there and forcing some level of, I wouldn't say near consensus, but least pain on each side to get the must pass bill through would be one example, right, of how you kind of slowly get stuff through Congress. But
Right.
I think we'll see another slow roll. This Congress was the most do nothing Congress, and I don't know if it's U.S. history, but at least in any recent memory, right? So
It
that
seems like
that's
each new Congress is always the most do nothing Congress.
okay.
At least they can still name some post offices, though, right?
Yeah, absolutely. But they couldn't help the Yankees win, but that's all another. We can talk about that later.
All right. So, another big issue that both campaigns have talked about is immigration.
Oh yeah.
Former President Trump has been very vocal and adamant about deporting illegal immigrants. And while it can sound extreme at his rallies, hasn't the Biden administration actually adopted or at least kept in place some of the Trump administration's border policies?
Yes. And I would say so. Yeah. So the Biden administration has kept some of the higher profile, Trump border policies. The Title 42 during the pandemic that
Right.
set up the ability for them to swiftly expel, migrants and asylum seekers at the border around the pandemic. Right, it was a health-driven uh, title, authority that they had. So when it's this again, the numbers matter, right? It's like so Trump put that in place. And from the implementation through the end of his office, about 400,000 people were detained and expelled out of the country, right?
Right.
So when you look at what the Biden administration, who kept that policy until the pandemic was over in, I don't know, mid 2023, they detained and expelled over 2 million
Right.
people, right? So by the numbers, Biden's been tougher on immigration than Trump, right?
Right.
So again, it's these kinds of things that just, it's why aren't we having like these factual open conversations? Immigration is definitely and should be a major policy issue for the next administration. What will be done or can be done, as we've said over and over, is going to depend on the makeup of Congress. But I do believe, any massive roundup by Trump will be tempered by just reality.
Yeah.
And Harris is going to be forced to address immigration in a more effective and demonstrable way. It's just that's a fact of where we are in this country, and how the majority of the country views immigration as a major issue.
Yeah, I feel like I read a story somewhere that said in order to do all of those deportations that he was talking about, the federal government would have to hire something like 500,000 new border patrol people in all the states, something ridiculous like that, just way more bureaucracy.
I think that's part of the reason that the deficit would be 8 billion under Trump than a contributor anyway.
Well, look, we could go on and on about all
Sure.
these issues for forever. There are so many variables here, but this episode is going to be coming out after the election has happened.
Mm-hmm.
So I want to go back all the way to the top and I want to ask you to pull that crystal ball out, Bruce.
Uh-oh.
By the time that this episode is in your podcast feed, are we going to know who the next president is?
Unless there's a massive win by one of the candidates early in the process, we are unlikely to see this resolved by, what is it, Thursday next week, a week
Yeah.
from now. So that would be my crystal ball that's not going to happen. If the counts are very close, and neither candidate and neither candidate has the 270 electoral college votes, meaning that some number of states are in a state of disarray or delay, we're going to see, independently of that, their schedule, we're going to see this flurry of legal and other issues that are going to pop up. And we can just see like this delay out and out and out, right?
Yeah.
Once these state by state, somebody tips the 270, we're still going to see a flurry of activity before it'll be called and the winner, well, I'm sure the winners could declare whatever they want, but anyway, just it's so so if it's a massive win, this can all happen very quickly, and probably by Thursday, Friday, Saturday, just similar like in 2020, this thing can get wrapped up and we're at 270, and there's still a lot of miscellaneous things that have to be dealt with but can be called. If it is really, really close and we don't get to 270, then we could see week after week. So,
well, it seems like a fool's errand to try and learn anything from polls at this point. My final question for you isn't about that, but it's more about, how close this election is. Do you think in the future, all of the elections are going to feel like this? It feels like we're a coin toss that heads or tails at any different point in time. I mean, is this just what elections look like in the United States of America going forward?
So when I speak to groups on this topic, the elections, and in this election, clearly, is only perceived to be close because of the constant noise around this poll or that poll, and those polls that are produced by one biased side versus the other, or cherry picked by the campaigns,
Right.
And so it's a perception of closeness. The underlying reality can be completely different. Okay.
Yeah.
And so when you look at just like the basic math of polls, right? It's a statistical process. You're sampling 2,000 or 3,000 people to determine how 100 million people might vote, right?
Yeah.
So when they look at these and go through all the parameters and stuff, they call the margin of error, right? So if they're tied within the margin of error, well, that's true. The margin of error just mathematically is like plus or minus 3%. That's a 6% swing of what could happen on election day, or even ultimately what's resolved when all the votes are counted. That Harris could be down 3 or up 3. Trump could be down 3 or up 3. Right. So, or they could be like dead tied, or don't even hit the 270. It's 269 each. Right. So we have no clue based on polls where that will be. We can say we have some confidence that it's going to be in that spread, but we don't know where.
Right.
So why are we agonizing over this and spending, if the media would spend more time educating voters on the facts that matter, the economy, the inflation, unemployment, the deficit, the things that they're going to make their choices on, and get rid of all the poll noise, I think we'd be in great stead. The worst thing is that when you actually, that's the mathematical, margin of error. When you actually look at the real kind of resulting margin of error, when you go back and actually look at polls and what actually happened in those elections, it's actually 6 to 7% margin of error.
Okay.
That's 12 to 14%.
Yeah, that's a lot.
So these polls are like doing nothing more than creating angst and noise and motivations for campaigns to get people to send donations, right? Oh, we're within 1 point. We need your money to get us over the line, that kind of thing. So it really is frustrating. And kind of my closing statement would be, so when people are listening to this, the election could be a tie or literal romp by either side, all within the margin of error.
It's something to remember. It's something that I will try to take to heart. And as soon as we're off this call, I'm sure I'll pull up CNN and see what the latest poll says and completely forget about it.
Don't do that.
Well, Bruce, Thank you so much for joining us
Absolutely.
today. Thank you so much for your insight. And let's just hope that the election goes smoothly and there's a clear winner, if only so I can stop getting so many texts and emails from these candidates. I'm tired of it at this point.
It is a noisy election, that's for sure.
It really is. So if our listeners want to pick your brain, where can they go to find you, Bruce?
McIndoeRiskAdvisory.com or LinkedIn. Easy to find.
Easy to find. All right. Thank you so much. And thank you so much for listening. Please visit us online at WTCI.org. Follow us on all social platforms at WTC Institute, and we will see you next time.